Montana Territory, 1879. The vast expanse of rolling hills and untamed prairie stretched out beneath a sky so wide it seemed to swallow the horizon whole. In this wild country, where the wind carried whispers of opportunity and danger in equal measure, Matthew Norris believed one thing with absolute certainty. A man survived the frontier by keeping to himself and trusting no one. The moment you let someone close was the moment you gave fate a target to aim for. At 25, Matthew had already lived enough frontier hardship for 2 lifetimes. Orphaned at 12 when Sioux raiders attacked their homestead, he'd grown into manhood with calloused hands and a heart he kept as tightly guarded as a bank vault. The Montana wilderness had taught him that sentiment was a luxury that got men killed. He'd built his small cattle operation through backbreaking work and relentless determination, accepting that loneliness was simply the price of survival. "Keep moving, boys," he called to the 3 cowboys who rode with him, pushing a small herd toward the valley where spring grass grew thick. His ranch was modest, nothing like the sprawling operations owned by cattle barons, but it was his, earned through sweat and stubborn persistence. The golden light of late afternoon caught on his sandy brown hair as he removed his hat to wipe his brow. Despite the hard lines around his eyes, Matthew's features held a youthful handsomeness that belied the weight of responsibility he carried. At 6 feet tall with broad shoulders from years of physical labor, he cut an impressive figure astride his buckskin gelding. Women in Timber Creek often cast appreciative glances his way, but Matthew had no time for such distractions. His life was ordered around one purpose, building something that would last in a land that took more than it gave. He had no way of knowing that fate was about to challenge everything he believed. The first sign of trouble was a plume of dust rising from the eastern ridge. Matthew's hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver at his hip as he squinted against the setting sun. "Rider coming fast," observed Jake, the oldest of his hired hands. "Might be trouble." As the rider drew closer, Matthew's eyes narrowed in confusion. It wasn't a man on horseback but a woman, her golden hair streaming behind her as she pushed her lathered horse at a dangerous pace. Her blue riding dress was torn at the hem, and even from this distance the panic in her posture was evident. "Something's wrong," Matthew muttered, spurring his horse forward. As he raced toward the woman, he saw her glance fearfully over her shoulder before her horse suddenly stumbled on the uneven ground. In a heart-stopping moment, the animal went down, throwing its rider into the air. Matthew reached her in seconds, leaping from his horse before it had fully stopped. The woman lay motionless on the ground, her face partially obscured by waves of honey-blonde hair. For a terrible moment, he thought she might be dead. Then she groaned softly, her eyelids fluttering. "Miss, can you hear me?" Matthew knelt beside her, hesitating before gently brushing the hair from her face, his breath caught in his throat. Despite the dirt smudged across her cheek and the small cut above her eyebrow, she was strikingly beautiful, with delicate features and full lips currently drawn in pain. Her eyes opened suddenly, revealing irises the color of summer cornflowers. For an instant they stared at each other, and Matthew felt something unexpected shift inside him. Then fear flooded her expression. She tried to scramble backward, wincing as she put weight on her right wrist. "Stay away," she gasped. "I'm not going to hurt you," Matthew said, holding up his hands. "You took a bad fall. Your horse is lame and you might be hurt." The woman glanced around wildly before fixing those blue eyes on him again. "Are you alone?" "My men are back with the herd." Matthew nodded toward the distant figures. "What's happened? Are you running from something?" She seemed to assess him, desperation warring with caution in her gaze. Finally, necessity won out. "My name is Olivia Carlton," she said, her voice cultured and clearly not from Montana territory. "And yes, I am running. My father's men will be looking for me. I will not go back." Before Matthew could respond, the sound of approaching horses echoed from the direction she'd come. Olivia's face paled. "Please," she whispered, "I will pay you whatever you ask, just don't tell them you saw me." Matthew hesitated only a moment. Frontier code dictated that a man mind his own business, especially when it came to family matters. Yet something in her desperate plea reached past his careful defenses. "Can you ride?" he asked abruptly. When she nodded, he helped her to her feet and onto his horse, noting how she bit her lip to keep from crying out when she moved her injured wrist. He mounted behind her just as 4 riders crested the ridge. "Hold tight," he murmured, turning his horse and galloping toward his men. "Jake," he called as they approached, "take the herd home. I've got business to attend to." Jake's weathered face registered surprise at the sight of the woman, but he asked no questions, a quality Matthew had always appreciated in the older man. As they rode toward his ranch, Matthew was acutely aware of Olivia's slender form pressed against him, the scent of lilac water somehow persisting despite her disheveled state. He told himself his racing heartbeat was merely from the exertion of the rescue. He was simply doing what any decent man would do, nothing more. By the time they reached his modest ranch house, the sun had disappeared behind the western mountains, leaving the sky painted in deepening shades of purple. Matthew helped Olivia down, noticing how she swayed slightly before straightening her spine with obvious determination. "Come inside, we need to look at that wrist," he said, his voice gruffer than intended. The cabin was simple but clean, with a main room that served as both kitchen and living area. A small bedroom lay beyond a partially open door. Olivia stood uncertainly in the center of the room, looking both regal and lost in her torn blue riding dress. "Sit," Matthew gestured to a chair by the table, lighting a lamp before gathering water and clean cloth. "Let me see your wrist." She hesitated before extending her arm. Her skin was pale and unblemished by the sun, her fingers slender and clearly unused to hard labor. As Matthew carefully examined her wrist, he noticed a gold bracelet engraved with an ornate C. "It's not broken," he determined. "Just sprained, I'll wrap it for now." "Thank you," Olivia said softly, watching him work. "You must think me terribly foolish, running away like this." Matthew didn't look up from his task. "It's not my place to judge your reasons." "No, I suppose not." A silence fell between them before she spoke again. "I'm 19 years old, Mr. Norris, and until yesterday, I've never made a single decision about my own life." Something in her voice made Matthew look up, meeting those blue eyes that somehow seemed to see right through him. "My father is Edmund Carlton." Matthew's hands stilled. Everyone in the territory knew of Edmund Carlton, a cattle baron who'd built an empire through ruthless business practices and political connections. His ranch, the Double C, covered more acres than some eastern states. "He arranged my marriage to Senator Willis's son," Olivia continued, her voice tight, "a man twice my age who already buried 2 wives. The wedding is scheduled for next week." "And you ran." "I ran," she confirmed, "with nothing but my horse and what little money I could gather, rather foolish, I realize now." Matthew finished bandaging her wrist, his mind racing. Harboring Edmund Carlton's daughter was asking for trouble he didn't need. The man's influence stretched throughout the territory, and he wasn't known for forgiveness. "You can stay the night," Matthew said, standing. "Tomorrow I'll take you to Helena. The stage runs east from there." Disappointment flickered across her face before she masked it with a polite smile. "Of course. Thank you for your kindness." Matthew moved to the stove, uncomfortable with her gratitude. He wasn't being kind, he was being practical. The sooner Olivia Carlton was gone from his life, the better. As he prepared a simple meal, he felt her watching him, those cornflower eyes following his movements. It unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. When he finally set 2 plates of beans and biscuits on the table, her attempt to conceal her dismay at the humble fare was almost comical. "I'm afraid I'm not much of a cook," he said, surprising himself with the apology. "No, it's wonderful," she insisted, taking a small bite and valiantly suppressing a grimace. "At home, I never even saw the kitchen. Father didn't believe it proper for me to learn such things." "And what things did he believe proper for you to learn?" "Playing the piano, embroidery, how to pour tea without spilling a drop." Her smile turned rueful. "Nothing that helps when you're running for your freedom." Despite himself, Matthew felt a smile tugging at his lips. "No, I imagine not." Their conversation continued through the simple meal, and Matthew found himself strangely captivated by this woman who had lived a life so different from his own yet spoke with such honesty. As night settled fully outside, he gave her his bed and made a pallet for himself by the fireplace, ignoring her protests that she should be the one to sleep there. Lying in the darkness, listening to the quiet sounds of the house settling, Matthew tried to ignore the awareness that Olivia Carlton slept just beyond the thin wall. Tomorrow, he would take her to Helena, put her on the eastbound stage, and return to his solitary life. The strange stirring in his chest whenever she looked at him with those blue eyes would fade, just another memory to be tucked away. Sleep came slowly that night, and when it did, Matthew dreamed of golden hair and the scent of lilacs. Morning arrived with a pounding at the door that jarred Matthew awake. He grabbed his revolver and moved swiftly to the window, cursing under his breath at the sight of 4 riders in the yard. Carlton's men had found them. "Get dressed quickly," he called to Olivia, pulling on his boots. "We have company." She emerged from the bedroom moments later, her face pale but composed. her torn riding dress replaced by one of his shirts tucked into her skirt. The sight of her in his clothing sent an unexpected jolt through him, one he immediately suppressed. "Stay inside," he instructed, moving to the door as another round of pounding began. He opened it to find a burly man with a thick mustache standing on his porch, hand resting on the revolver at his hip. 3 others waited mounted behind him. "Morning," Matthew said evenly. "Something I can help you with." "Looking for a young woman," the man said without preamble. "Blonde hair, blue riding dress, Carlton's daughter, seen her." Matthew leaned against the doorframe, keeping his expression neutral. "Can't say that I have." "Something happened to her." The man's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Carlton's offering $500 for information leading to her safe return. She's, confused, ran off before her wedding." "That's a shame," Matthew replied. "But I haven't seen any women out this way, let alone a rich man's daughter." The man studied him for a long moment before nodding toward the house. "Mind if we have a look inside, just to be thorough?" Matthew tensed, his hand inching toward his own weapon. "Actually, I do mind, this is my property." "Mr. Carlton won't take kindly to interference," the man warned. "And I don't take kindly to trespassers," Matthew countered. "Now I've answered your question, time for you to move on." The standoff stretched for several heartbeats before the man spat on the ground. "We'll be watching the roads. That girl shows up, you'd be wise to remember who runs this territory." Matthew said nothing, watching as they mounted up and rode away. Only when they disappeared from sight did he close the door and turn to find Olivia standing in the middle of the room, her face drawn with worry. "They'll be watching for me," she said quietly. "I can't go to Helena now." Matthew ran a hand through his hair, weighing his options. The rational part of his mind told him to send her on her way, this wasn't his problem. But another part, when he'd thought long dormant, couldn't ignore the fear in those blue eyes. "There's another way," he said finally. "A trail through the mountains. It's longer, but it'll take us around Helena to the next stage stop at Fort Benton." "Us?" Olivia asked, hope lighting her features. "I can't very well send you alone," he muttered. "We'll leave at nightfall." The smile that transformed her face caught him off guard. For a moment, he glimpsed something beyond the polished society girl, a flash of determination and spirit that resonated with something deep inside him. "Thank you, Matthew," she said, using his given name for the first time. The sound of it on her lips made his chest tighten in a way he didn't want to examine too closely. "Don't thank me yet," he warned. "It's dangerous country and Carlton's men aren't the only threat. The journey will be hard, especially for someone used to comfort." Her chin lifted slightly. "I may have lived a sheltered life, Mr. Norris, but I'm not made of china. I won't break at the first difficulty." Despite himself, Matthew felt the corner of his mouth lift in a half-smile. "We'll see about that." They spent the day preparing, Matthew packing provisions and checking his weapons, while Olivia insisted on helping despite her injured wrist. He found himself surprised by her willingness to learn as he showed her how to saddle a horse properly and secure bedrolls. As dusk approached, Jake returned from town with troubling news. Carlton's men were everywhere and the reward for information had doubled. The old cowhand eyed Olivia warily before pulling Matthew aside. "You're playing a dangerous game, boss," he warned. "Carlton doesn't forget when someone crosses him." "I'm just helping her get to Fort Benton," Matthew insisted. "Then she's on her way east and I'm back here." Jake's weathered face creased with skepticism. "Just be careful. That girl's trouble wrapped in a pretty package." Matthew couldn't argue with that assessment as they set out under the cover of darkness, Olivia now dressed in borrowed trousers and one of his shirts, her long hair tucked beneath a hat. The disguise would help if they encountered anyone on the trail, but it did little to diminish her beauty, a fact Matthew tried unsuccessfully to ignore as they rode side by side under the star-filled sky. The mountain trail was treacherous in daylight and doubly so at night. They moved slowly, guided by moonlight and Matthew's knowledge of the terrain. When they finally made camp in a sheltered gully shortly before dawn, exhaustion had etched lines around Olivia's eyes, but she hadn't uttered a single complaint. "You should rest," Matthew said as he built a small, smokeless fire. "We'll move again at nightfall." Olivia nodded, wrapping herself in a blanket and settling beside the fire. "May I ask you something?" Matthew looked up from the coffee he was preparing. "Depends on the question." "Why are you helping me?" "You could have taken the reward, or simply sent me on my way." The question caught him off guard. It was something he'd been asking himself since the moment he'd spotted her riding across his land. The practical answer that it was the decent thing to do felt hollow even to his own ears. "I don't much care for men who force their will on others," he said finally, "even rich ones. Especially rich ones." She studied him across the fire, her gaze thoughtful. "There's more to it than that, I think, but I won't press." They fell silent as dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in streaks of pink and gold. Despite his exhaustion, Matthew found himself watching Olivia as she gazed at the sunrise, her face softened with wonder. "I've never seen anything so beautiful," she whispered. "At home, I rarely left the house before noon." "The mountains have a way of making a person see things differently," Matthew said. "Out here, it doesn't matter who your father is or how much money you have. The land treats everyone the same." "Is that why you live out here alone, to escape society's expectations?" The question hit closer to home than he cared to admit. "I live alone because it's simpler that way, no one to worry about. No one to lose." Olivia's eyes met his across the fire. "That sounds terribly lonely." "Better lonely than heartbroken," he replied before he could stop himself. Something in her expression told him she understood more than he'd intended to reveal. Rather than pursue it, she simply nodded and closed her eyes, leaving Matthew to wonder at the strange connection forming between them, one he wasn't sure he wanted but couldn't seem to resist. They traveled for 3 more nights, keeping to the rugged mountain trails and resting during daylight hours. With each passing day, Matthew found himself increasingly impressed by Olivia's resilience. Despite blisters on her hands and the evident soreness from hours in the saddle, she never complained. Instead, she asked questions about the land, about his cattle operation, about the skills needed to survive in this unforgiving country. And despite his best intentions, Matthew found himself answering, sharing pieces of his life he'd never spoken aloud to anyone. He told her about losing his parents, about working cattle drives as a boy, about saving every penny to buy his first plot of land. In turn, Olivia shared stories of her confined upbringing, of a controlling father who saw her as nothing more than an asset to be traded for political advantage, of a mother who had withered under Edmund Carlton's domineering presence until illness took her when Olivia was 14. "I think that's when I first understood I would have to save myself," she confessed one evening as they sat beside a mountain stream where they'd stopped to rest the horses. "No knight in shining armor was coming to rescue me from my tower." "Yet here you are, running away from an unwanted marriage," Matthew observed, skipping a stone across the water's surface. "Yes, but I ran first," she pointed out with a smile that transformed her face. "Besides, you're hardly a knight in shining armor, Mr. Norris, more like a reluctant guide with a questionable cooking ability." Matthew found himself laughing, the sound rusty from disuse yet surprisingly genuine. "Fair enough, Miss Carlton." "Olivia," she corrected. "After sharing trail rations and sleeping under the same stars for days, I think we can dispense with formalities." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the connection between them felt almost tangible. Matthew looked away first, uncomfortable with the warmth spreading through his chest. "We should reach Fort Benton tomorrow night," he said, standing abruptly. "The stage east runs twice weekly." Olivia's smile dimmed slightly. "Yes, of course. I'm grateful for your help getting there." That night, as they made camp in a sheltered grove of pines, the comfortable silence that had developed between them felt suddenly weighted with unspoken words. Matthew busied himself with practical tasks, trying to ignore the hollow feeling that had opened in his chest at the thought of their impending separation. It was foolishness, he told himself sternly. Olivia Carlton belonged to a different world, one of wealth and privilege, despite her current circumstances. Once she reached the East, she would surely find a place among her own kind. The frontier would become nothing more than an unpleasant memory, as would he. Yet as he watched her brushing her golden hair beside the fire, humming softly to herself, Matthew couldn't quiet the voice whispering that he was losing something precious before he'd even acknowledged finding it. The next morning dawned with an ominous gray sky that matched Matthew's mood. They packed quickly, both aware that a storm was brewing, both in the heavens and between them. The easy conversation of previous days had given way to strained silence, broken only by necessary communication about the trail ahead. They had just crossed a mountain pass when the weather turned violent. Thunder crashed overhead as rain began to pour in blinding sheets. The horses grew skittish and the trail quickly turned into a muddy, dangerous slope. "There's a line cabin ahead," Matthew shouted over the storm. "We need to take shelter." They pushed forward, the horses struggling against the wind and mud. Matthew kept Olivia's mount close to his, acutely aware of the treacherous drop to their right. Just as the small cabin came into view, a blinding flash of lightning split the sky, followed immediately by a deafening crash of thunder. Olivia's horse reared in panic. Matthew lunged for the reins, but was too late. She slid from the saddle, landing hard on the muddy trail as the frightened animal bolted. In an instant, Matthew was off his horse and at her side, fear gripping his heart as she lay motionless in the mud. "Olivia," he shouted, gathering her into his arms. To his immense relief, her eyes fluttered open, disoriented but conscious. "I'm all right," she gasped, though the grimace of pain as she tried to stand suggested otherwise. "Just my ankle." Without hesitation, Matthew lifted her into his arms and carried her the remaining distance to the cabin, his heart pounding with something that went beyond physical exertion. Inside the small, dusty shelter, he gently set her on a crude bench and quickly built a fire in the stone fireplace. In the flickering light, he examined her ankle, trying to ignore how his hands trembled slightly as they touched her rain-soaked skin. "It's not broken," he determined, "but it's a bad sprain. You won't be walking on it for a few days." Olivia leaned back against the wall, her golden hair plastered to her face, her borrowed clothes soaked through. Despite her bedraggled appearance, or perhaps because of it, she had never looked more beautiful to Matthew. "It seems I'm destined to delay your plans," she said with a weak attempt at humor. "First my wrist, now my ankle." "The stage will still be there when you can walk," he replied, moving to retrieve blankets from his saddlebags. "We'll wait out the storm here." As night fell, the storm raged outside while inside the small cabin, a different kind of tension built. Matthew had helped Olivia into dry clothes, keeping his eyes averted in a gentleman's gesture that felt absurdly formal given their circumstances. They shared a simple meal of jerky and hardtack, sitting before the fire as their clothes dried on makeshift lines. "Tell me about your ranch," Olivia said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Not just the facts, but what it means to you, why you stay despite the hardship." Matthew stared into the fire, considering her question. "It's freedom, I suppose. Every post in the fence, every head of cattle, they represent something I built with my own hands, something no one can take from me." "Unlike your family," she said softly. He nodded, surprised by her perception. "When raiders took my parents, I learned that people can be taken from you in an instant. Land, if you protect it right, stays. Is that why you keep everyone at a distance? To protect yourself from loss?" The directness of her question startled him. Matthew looked up to find her watching him with those perceptive blue eyes that seemed to see right through his carefully constructed walls. "We all have our ways of surviving," he said, his voice rough. "Yes," she agreed, "but surviving isn't the same as living, is it?" Before he could respond, a particularly violent gust of wind rattled the cabin's shutters. Olivia jumped slightly, wincing as the movement jarred her injured ankle. Without thinking, Matthew moved to sit beside her, offering his warmth and presence as comfort against the storm's fury. "What will you do when you reach the east?" he asked, changing the subject. Olivia was quiet for a moment, her shoulder warm against his. "I have a distant aunt in Boston. I wrote to her before I left, though I don't know if she received my letter. Beyond that," she shrugged, "I have some education, perhaps I could become a teacher." The image of Olivia in a prim schoolhouse, surrounded by eager children, pulled at something deep in Matthew's chest. "You be good at that, you're patient, observant." "High praise from a man of few words," she teased, though her smile held a touch of sadness. "The truth is I'm terrified. I've never been on my own before, never had to support myself." "But the alternative? Going back to your father, to the marriage he arranged?" She nodded, her expression hardening. "I would rather face 1,000 uncertainties than live one day as the possession of a man who sees me as nothing more than a political connection. At least this way, whatever happens, the choices are mine." Her courage struck Matthew with unexpected force. This woman, raised in luxury and sheltered from hardship, possessed a strength of spirit that matched anyone he'd met on the frontier. In that moment, something shifted inside him, a crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. "You'll succeed," he said with conviction. "You're stronger than you know." Olivia looked up at him, surprise and gratitude mingling in her expression. "Thank you for seeing that. Most people only see the rich man's daughter." "I see you, Olivia," he said quietly. The air between them changed, charged with an awareness that had been building since the moment he'd found her thrown from her horse. Her eyes dropped to his lips, and Matthew felt himself leaning closer, drawn by a force beyond his control. The crack of a branch outside the cabin shattered the moment. Matthew was on his feet instantly, hand going to his revolver as he moved to the window. "What is it?" Olivia whispered. "Probably nothing," he said, though his instincts screamed otherwise. "Stay here." He peered through the rain-streaked window, straining to see in the darkness. For a moment he saw nothing. Then a flash of lightning illuminated the clearing and the three mounted figures approaching the cabin. "Carlton's men," he said grimly, turning back to Olivia. "They must have followed our trail." Fear flashed across her face before hardening into determination. "What do we do?" Matthew assessed their options quickly. The storm had trapped them as effectively as it had likely slowed their pursuers. There was nowhere to run, especially with Olivia's injured ankle. "I'll handle this," he said, checking his revolver. "Stay out of sight." Before he could move to the door, Olivia caught his arm. "They'll kill you," she said, her voice tight with fear. "There are too many of them." "I've faced worse odds," he replied, though they both knew it for the bravado it was. Olivia's grip tightened. "I won't let you die for me, Matthew. There has to be another way." The pounding on the door interrupted their debate. "We know you're in there, Norris," a voice called. "Send out the Carlton girl, and maybe we won't burn this place down around you." Matthew met Olivia's eyes, seeing the conflict there. "Trust me," he said softly. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded, releasing his arm. Matthew moved to the door, positioning himself to block the view inside. "Evening, gentlemen," he said calmly as he opened the door to face the three armed men on the porch. He recognized the leader as the same man who had come to his ranch days earlier. "Nasty night to be out." "Cut the act, Norris," the man growled. "We know the girl's with you, mister. Carlton wants his daughter back." "Is that right?" Matthew leaned against the doorframe, his posture relaxed while his mind raced. "And what does Miss Carlton want?" The question seemed to catch the man off guard. "What she wants doesn't matter. She's promised to another man." "In my experience, forcing a woman into something she doesn't want rarely ends well," Matthew observed, "especially one with spirit enough to ride out alone in the middle of the night." "This isn't your concern," the man said, his hand moving toward his weapon. "Step aside. I'm afraid I can't do that." The standoff hung in the air between them, tension crackling like the lightning overhead. Matthew knew he was outgunned and outnumbered, but he'd be damned if he'd hand Olivia over to these men. "You're willing to die for some rich girl you barely know?" the man asked incredulously. Before Matthew could respond, Olivia's voice came from behind him. "He's not going to die for anyone." Matthew turned to see her standing in the middle of the cabin, her weight balanced on her good ankle, her chin lifted in defiance. "Olivia, no." She moved forward, placing a restraining hand on his arm as she faced her father's men. "I will return with you on one condition," she said, her voice steady despite the fear Matthew could feel in her trembling fingers. "Mr. Norris is to be left unharmed. If anything happens to him now or in the future, I will ensure my father regrets it. Am I understood?" The lead man eyed her with surprise before nodding. "We're just here for you, miss. Not looking for extra trouble." Matthew turned to her, disbelief and betrayal washing through him. "You can't go back to them." Olivia's blue eyes met his, filled with a mixture of resolve and regret. "I can't let you die for me either." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Trust me, Matthew." Before he could protest further, she had hobbled past him onto the porch. One of the men lifted her onto his horse, her face wincing in pain as her injured ankle was jostled. "Olivia," Matthew called, taking a step forward only to find himself looking down the barrel of a revolver. "Stay put, Norris," the leader warned. The girls made her choice. As they rode away into the stormy night, Olivia looked back once, her face pale in the darkness. Then she was gone, leaving Matthew standing in the doorway, the rain mingling with the unfamiliar sting of tears he refused to acknowledge. For 3 days, Matthew remained at the line cabin, telling himself he was waiting for the trails to dry rather than admitting the hollow ache in his chest. Olivia's absence felt like a physical wound, one that deepened with each passing hour. He replayed their final moments endlessly, trying to understand the meaning behind her last words. Trust me. What had she meant? Trust her to handle her father, trust her to find another way to escape. Or had it simply been a plea for forgiveness, as she resigned herself to her fate? On the 4th morning, as Matthew prepared to finally return to his ranch, a rider approached the cabin. He reached for his weapon, half expecting Carlton's men returning to finish what they'd started. Instead, he found himself facing Jake, his foreman's weathered face grave. "Been looking for you for 2 days, the old cowhand said without preamble. "There's trouble." "Carlton?" Matthew asked, his chest tightening. Yes and no. The girl's back at your ranch. Matthew stared at him in disbelief. Olivia, how? Showed up yesterday, half dead from riding with that bad ankle, said Carlton's men were after her again. Jake shook his head, but that's not the worst of it. Carlton himself is on the warpath. Word is he's gathering men to come after you for kidnapping his daughter. Matthew swung onto his horse without hesitation. How many men? Dozen, maybe more, armed to the teeth. Jake eyed him. You planning to make a stand against those odds? Matthew's jaw tightened. Get back to the ranch, tell Olivia I'm coming. And Jake, he fixed the older man with a hard stare, keep her safe until I get there. He rode harder than was wise on the still muddy trails, his mind racing faster than his horse. If Carlton was coming with armed men, his small ranch wouldn't stand a chance. He needed to get Olivia away before they arrived, but where could they go that Carlton's influence wouldn't reach? The answer came to him suddenly, clear as a mountain stream. There was one place, one person, even Edmund Carlton would hesitate to cross. By the time Matthew reached his ranch, the afternoon sun was sinking toward the western mountains. He found Olivia on the porch, her injured ankle bandaged, her face lighting with relief at the sight of him. Matthew, she started to rise, wincing as she put weight on her foot. He was off his horse and at her side in an instant, fighting the urge to pull her into his arms. What happened? Jake said you escaped again. Olivia nodded, her expression grim. They took me back to the Double C. Father had moved the wedding up. It was to happen yesterday. Her voice hardened. I refused. When he locked me in my room, I climbed out the window. One of the kitchen maids helped me get a horse. Your father will be here by nightfall with armed men, Matthew said. We need to leave now. And go where? Olivia asked. They'll follow us wherever we go. Not everywhere, Matthew met her gaze steadily. I know somewhere even your father won't follow, but we have to hurry. Within an hour, they were riding north, Olivia seated before Matthew on his strongest horse. He'd left instructions with Jake to delay Carlton if possible, but not to risk his life or those of the other hands. The ranch could be rebuilt, lives could not. As they rode, Matthew explained his plan. Judge McAllister in Silver Creek was known for his strict adherence to the law and his immunity to bribery or intimidation. More importantly, he was one of the few men in the territory with enough political clout to stand against Edmund Carlton. If we can reach Silver Creek and explain the situation, the judge can issue a legal injunction preventing your father from forcing the marriage, Matthew explained. It won't stop him forever, but it will give us time to make other arrangements. Us? Olivia asked, her voice soft against the rhythm of the horse's hooves. Matthew hesitated, suddenly aware of what he'd revealed. I won't abandon you to face this alone, he said carefully. They rode through the night, stopping only briefly to rest the horse. By dawn, they had reached the foothills north of Matthew's ranch, following a little-known trail that wound through dense forest. Matthew kept a vigilant watch behind them, but there was no sign of pursuit. We should reach Silver Creek by nightfall, he said as they paused beside a stream to water the horse. If we're lucky, your father is still searching my property. Olivia slid carefully from the saddle, wincing as her injured ankle touched the ground. Despite her evident exhaustion, determination shone in her eyes. Matthew, there's something I need to say. He helped her to a fallen log, his hands lingering on her waist longer than necessary. What is it? When I left with my father's men at the cabin, she looked up at him, her blue eyes earnest. I wasn't giving up, I was buying time for both of us. If I had refused, they would have killed you and taken me anyway. I know, Matthew admitted, kneeling before her. I realized it after you were gone, but why did you come back to my ranch instead of heading straight for Fort Benton? A flush colored her cheeks, because I couldn't leave without seeing you again. Without explaining, her hand tentatively touched his face, and because in those days we spent together, I discovered something I never expected to find. Matthew's heart pounded against his ribs as he covered her hand with his own. And what was that? That freedom isn't just about escaping something, it's about choosing something. Her eyes held his, vulnerable yet certain, someone. The walls around Matthew's heart crumbled completely. He leaned forward, finally giving in to the desire that had been building since he first saw her riding across his land. Their lips met in a kiss that began gently but quickly deepened with the intensity of feelings too long denied. When they finally pulled apart, Matthew rested his forehead against hers. I told myself it was madness, he confessed, that someone like you could never belong in my world. Perhaps it's not about belonging in a world, Olivia suggested, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. but creating our own. The sound of distant hoofbeats shattered the moment. Matthew was on his feet instantly, helping Olivia up and toward the horse. "They've found our trail," he said grimly. "We need to move." They rode hard through the forest, the sounds of pursuit growing steadily closer. Matthew pushed their mount as much as he dared, acutely aware of Olivia's arms tightening around his waist whenever they took a particularly rough section of trail. By mid-afternoon, it became clear they wouldn't reach Silver Creek before being overtaken. As they crested a ridge, Matthew spotted a small trapper's cabin nestled among the pines ahead. "We'll make our stand there," he decided, guiding the horse down the slope. Inside the abandoned cabin, Matthew quickly assessed their situation. The structure was solid, with only 2 windows and a single door, defensible if not ideal. He had his revolver and rifle with ammunition for both. "They'll surround us," Olivia said quietly, standing beside him at the window. "Yes," he agreed, "but they'll have to come through the door eventually. And I'm a good shot." She turned to him, her face pale but resolute. "I won't let you die for me, Matthew." "No one's dying today," he promised, though they both heard the uncertainty beneath his words. The thunder of approaching horses announced Carlton's arrival. Matthew counted at least 8 riders as they emerged from the trees, Edmund Carlton himself at their head. He was a large man with steel-gray hair and cold eyes that resembled his daughter's only in color. "Olivia," Carlton's voice boomed across the clearing. "Come out now, and I might let this kidnapper live." Matthew felt Olivia tense beside him. "Stay here," he said, moving toward the door. "What are you doing?" she hissed, catching his arm. "Buying time," he replied with a confidence he didn't feel. "Trust me." Matthew stepped onto the cabin's small porch, his rifle held loosely in his hands but not aimed. Carlton and his men immediately drew their weapons. "Mr. Carlton," Matthew called, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding is yours if you think you can steal my daughter," Carlton replied coldly. "Send her out now." "Your daughter came to me of her own free will," Matthew said, "twice. She's made her choice clear." Carlton's face darkened with anger. "She's 19 years old, she doesn't know what she wants." "I disagree," Matthew held the older man's gaze steadily. "She's shown more courage and determination than most men I know. She deserves the right to choose her own path." "Enough of this nonsense," Carlton snarled, signaling to his men. "Burn them out if you have to." As the armed men began to dismount, the cabin door opened behind Matthew. Olivia stepped out, her hand finding his in a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by her father. "I won't be going with you, father," she called, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "Not today, not ever." Carlton's face contorted with rage. "You ungrateful child. After everything I've provided." "You provided a prison," Olivia interrupted, "and decided my life without ever asking what I wanted." "This is absurd," Carlton spat. "You're coming home to fulfill your obligation to this family. Senator Willis's son is expecting a bride." "Then he'll be disappointed," Olivia replied. "I will not marry a man I do not love." Carlton's cold eyes shifted to Matthew. "And I suppose you think you love this, Cowboy? This nobody with a worthless patch of land?" "Yes," Olivia said simply, "I do." The word hung in the air between them, and Matthew turned to her in surprise. Olivia met his gaze with unwavering certainty, a small smile curving her lips despite the danger surrounding them. "And I love her," Matthew said, the truth of it filling his chest with unexpected lightness even as he turned back to face the armed men. "Which is why I won't let you force her into a life she doesn't want." Carlton signaled to his men, who raised their weapons. "Love won't stop bullets, boy." "No," came a new voice from the tree line, "but the law might have something to say about it." All heads turned to see a group of riders emerging from the forest, led by an older man with a silver star pinned to his vest. Behind him rode at least a dozen armed men, including Jake and Matthew's other ranch hands. "Judge McAllister," Carlton said, his confident demeanor faltering slightly. "This is a private family matter." The judge dismounted, his weathered face stern as he approached. "Threatening armed violence on territorial land is hardly private, Carlton," he looked at Olivia. "Young lady, I received a rather interesting telegram from a kitchen maid at your father's ranch. Says you're being forced into marriage against your will." "That's correct, Your Honor," Olivia confirmed, her grip on Matthew's hand tightening. "My father arranged my marriage to Senator Willis's son without my consent." "Interesting," the judge mused. "And illegal, as I'm sure you know, Carlton, No woman can be forced into marriage in this territory, regardless of her father's wishes. Carlton's face flushed with anger. She's my daughter. She's a citizen of this territory, the judge interrupted, with the same rights as any other. He turned to Olivia. Miss Carlton, what is it you want? Olivia straightened, her voice clear and confident. I want my freedom, Your Honor, the right to choose my own path. Her eyes met Matthew's, and the man I love. Judge McAllister nodded. Then that's what you shall have. He turned back to Carlton. I suggest you and your men leave now, before I decide to charge you with attempted kidnapping and assault. For a moment, it seemed Carlton might defy even the judge. Then with a cold glare at Matthew and his daughter, he turned to his men. This isn't over, he warned before mounting his horse. As Carlton and his men rode away, the tension drained from Matthew's body. He turned to Olivia, hardly daring to believe they were safe. You knew the judge was coming, he asked. She smiled, her eyes sparkling with mischief. I may have asked that kitchen maid to send a telegram when she helped me escape. I wasn't certain he would come in time. Matthew shook his head in amazement. You continue to surprise me, Olivia Carlton. I hope to do so for many years to come, she replied softly. Judge McAllister approached them, his expression softening. You two have had quite an adventure from what I gather. Yes, Your Honor, Matthew agreed, and I thank you for arriving when you did. Thank the lady's quick thinking, the judge said with a nod toward Olivia. Now I assume from what I just witnessed that there might be a wedding in your future, one of your own choosing. Matthew looked at Olivia, suddenly uncertain. Despite her declaration before her father, he realized they had never properly discussed a future together. If she'll have me, he said quietly. Olivia's answer was to rise on her tiptoes, ignoring the pain in her ankle, and press her lips to his in a kiss that left no doubt about her feelings. 2 months later, as autumn painted the Montana mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Matthew stood beneath an arch of wildflowers outside his ranch house, which now boasted a new addition and several improvements. Beside him stood Jake, his weathered face uncharacteristically emotional as Judge McAllister prepared to begin the ceremony. When Olivia appeared, walking slowly across the yard on her father's arm, Matthew felt his breath catch in his throat. Her wedding dress was simple but elegant, her golden hair crowned with a circlet of wildflowers, but it was the radiant joy in her face that truly transfixed him. To everyone's surprise, Edmund Carlton had grudgingly reconciled with his daughter after several weeks of stubborn silence. While he still clearly disapproved of her choice, he had ultimately recognized the strength of will she had inherited from him. Today, as he placed her hand in Matthew's, there was a grudging respect in his nod. Take care of her, was all he said before stepping back. Always, Matthew promised. As they exchanged vows beneath the vast Montana sky, surrounded by friends and neighbors from miles around, Matthew marveled at how completely his life had transformed in the span of a few short months. The walls he had built around his heart lay in ruins, replaced by a love that filled every corner of his being. I now pronounce you husband and wife, Judge McAllister declared. You may kiss your bride. As their lips met, sealing their commitment to one another, Matthew silently thanked whatever twist of fate had sent Olivia racing across his land that fateful day. The rich rancher's daughter had indeed fled straight into his heart. That evening, as they stood on the porch of their home watching the sunset paint the mountains in fiery hues, Matthew wrapped his arms around his wife from behind. Any regrets? He asked softly, still hardly believing this remarkable woman had chosen a life with him. Olivia turned in his arms, her blue eyes reflecting the golden light. Only that I didn't run away sooner, she replied with a smile. I've finally found where I belong. As darkness settled over the Montana wilderness, the light in the window of the Norris ranch burned bright, a beacon of the love and home they had built together in this wild, beautiful land.